So weirdly enough, we just did rock and roll, like pure rock and roll. Um, a lot of things are miscalled rock and roll, but really rock and roll was only a period of like 6 years, give or take. Like maybe 1954-ish. I mean, again, it's hard to pinpoint like this is the moment rock and roll existed. It doesn't really work that way. But roughly mid 1950s to the end of the 50s. Okay, that little chunk of time was pure rock and roll. And you can boil it down to a very small amount, maybe like 12 people that were actual rock and roll artists. Okay, a lot of music is called rock and roll that's not technically. It's either rock or some version of rock, like sub genre of rock. Pure rock and roll are those founding fathers of rock, the ones that were on that quiz for the most part. There's a few others. We didn't get to all of them. But so ironically, we get to the end of the decade and a bunch of crap hit the proverbial fan. Okay? Times are already volatile. There's a lot going on. We've got the civil rights movement. We've got, there's a lot of political stuff that's going around. We've got all this racial tensions. Sounds a lot like 2020, doesn't it? But anyway, so all this stuff is happening. And there was just like a set of circumstances that occurred in the lives of a lot of these founding fathers. If you had one of these guys for your project, you might already know part of this material because you might know what happened to your person that halted their career. So we get to the end of the decade and a bunch of unrelated events all happen at the same time and halt the career of 5 artists and 1 DJ. And rock and roll like dies. Okay, now it will be reborn, much as a phoenix from the ashes, in other genres, which we're going to get to. But true rock and roll dies. Boom. 5 or 6 years and done. So today I'm going to go over what happened to each of those people and what and how that kind of impacted their career. So the biggest one we're going to start with, which is in the notes here on the screen, is the payola scandal. And this is what happened to Alan Freed. We remember Alan Freed when we talked about rhythm and blues, and he was the first one to kind of call it rock and roll on his radio show. He was an icon. His show was very popular. And Alan Freed got into some trouble. Ooh. So we are going to talk about that right now, and then we'll talk about the 5 artists that also had some things happen. So payola is kind of a mashup of words. It has pay for like being bribed, which is what we're getting into, and the Victrola, which is those old like early record players. So put them together, you get payola. So that's where that came from. So the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, which is called ASCAP. ASCAP is still around. And even if you look on the bottom of like a piece of sheet music or something, when you buy something, a part of that money goes to ASCAP. Okay. So that's what that means. If you ever see that on a CD or somewhere, that's what that means. They believed rock and roll records were played so often by greedy DJs that it was impacting unsuspecting teenagers. A little paranoid, okay? So, again, they were kind of buying into that narrative that rock and roll was bad, rock and roll was the devil, et cetera, et cetera. They viewed rock and roll as a passing fad, okay? And when all this hit the fan with the bribery allegations, they were trying to essentially make sure that rock and roll stopped. They were trying to, like, put the kibosh on these DJs from playing all these rock and roll records as a group of people. Okay, because ASCAP's made up of a lot of people. So Billboard magazine put the cancer of payola cannot be pinned on rock and roll, coming to the defense of rock and roll a bit, saying the cancer of this bribery that was happening with the DJs, which we're going to talk about, is not the fault of rock and roll. It's the fault of corrupt DJs. So what was happening is Alan Freed, Dick Clark, and a bunch of other DJs got in all of this trouble for accepting money. So like someone walks in, they're like, hey, I've got this new rock and roll record. Here's $20. Can you play my record? And allegedly these DJs were taking these bribes and playing these records more often because you're getting all these records all the time from all these record companies, from all these artists. How do you choose what to play? You only have a limited amount of airtime, right? And again, radio was huge back in the day. It was a big deal. So the allegation with the payola scandal was that these DJs were accepting bribes. And ASCAP was like, aha, now we've got them. We're going to pin corruption and bribery on rock and roll, and then it'll go away. That was kind of what was going on. So It goes to court. The committee decided to look into DJs who took gifts from record companies in return for playing their records on their shows. Soon, 25 DJs and program directors were caught in the scandal. The investigation quickly focused on the top 2 DJs in the country, Dick Clark, who some of you might be kind of young, but you may know him as the guy who hosted the New Year ball drop, like the big New Year's Eve ball drop. He hosted it for years and years and years. His career did not get as screwed up as Alan Freed's. And Dick Clark passed just a few years ago. So Dick Clark and Alan Freed were the 2 most famous. So they were taking the brunt and all the publicity of this court case scandal. In late November of 1960, I believe, Freed was fired from both ABC Radio and WNEW TV. Clark, however, who had more to lose because he was hosting a television show at the time, I believe it was American Bandstand, he gave up all his musical interests, and he was ordered to do this by ABC TV, and then he was asked to sign a statement denying that was Freed, sorry. So he gave up his musical interests and focused on television and somehow managed to kind of avoid getting in as much trouble as Alan Freed did as a DJ. Freed refused to sign a statement denying involvement, and he was fired from WINS. When Clark appeared to testify, he brought Bernard Goldsmith, a statistician, which is someone who does the numbers, right? And Goldsmith told the committee that Clark had a 27% interest in records played in the last 28 months, and those records had a 23% popularity rating. The committee was stunned and wondered, what came first, the chicken or the egg? So what that means, essentially, he brought in a math guy. The math guy was like, he clearly is innocent because of this percentage, and this percentage. These records aren't as popular, And somehow, by bringing in the statistician to back up Clark saying, I didn't do it. Here's the numbers. I don't know how you could quantify that, but whatever. So the committee, I'll just read this paragraph. Clark's testimony began with telling the committee he'd given up on all outside interests connected with the recording industry. He also said the only reason he'd gotten involved with those businesses was for tax advantages, and he denied accepting bribes from record companies. The committee didn't believe Clark, but he just received a slap on the wrist, and the committee chairman, Orrin Harris, called Clark, quote, a fine young man. So Dick Clark kind of got off scot-free. Alan Freed, not so much. The first court case involving payola was in 1960. On May 9th, you're going to need this date for your paper. On May 9th of 1960, Alan Freed was indicted for accepting $2,500, which he claimed was a token of gratitude and did not affect airplay, which means what he picked to be on the radio. He paid a small fine and was released. However, his career was ruined, and in 1965, he drank himself to death, penniless and bitter. Ugh. He was 43. Before Alan Freed's indictment, payola was not illegal, but commercial bribery was. After the trial, the anti-payola statute was passed, under which payola became a misdemeanor crime. So to this day, you cannot go to a radio station and be like, hey, here's my band's new record. Will you play it? I'll give you money. That is illegal now. But that wasn't really on the books. It wasn't really a law until this all sort of happened. But it smeared rock and roll. It made it look bad because Alan Freed, who was the guy who was like the rock and roll radio show guy, was now a convicted, like he'd been found guilty. He'd lost his career. He was fired. Okay. Dick Clark kind of stayed with television, managed to make it out okay. In the middle here, this is Dick Clark. I know it's kind of a tough picture to see. And over here with the coat on his arm, this is Alan Freed. And I think this is the guy who had all the math, Goldstein. Okay. All right. We're scrolling down. The death of rock and roll. Dun, dun, dun. So I'd like you to try and open this document in Kami. If you haven't been able to get Kami, try and restart your computer. And then when you go to click on it, click open with, and it should be with Kami. It's a purple K in a box. Hopefully you can edit it and then add text boxes to this document and then save and submit. Okay. If not, you'll just have to type it in a separate doc and share it with me. Okay. You'll just have to type Jerry Lee Lewis, what ended his career when. Okay. So we're going to talk about what happened to these people. Now, Alan Freed, we just did, which is the third box down. So you're going to go into the third box. Actually, I'm going to make a second part to this video that I'm going to upload. Thank you.